And thank you to the audience for being here, and particularly thank you to the panel. I think you'll really see that they are a truly expert group of people. First of all, I'd like to introduce Professor Sir Nigel Shadbolt, who's a leading researcher in artificial intelligence and was one of the originators of the interdisciplinary field of web science. He's principal of Jesus College, Oxford, and a professor of computing science at the University of Oxford. He's the chairman of the Open Data Institute and was knighted in 2013 for services to science and engineering. I would probably say he's maybe the leading researcher we have, particularly in the UK, in this area. So welcome, Sir Nigel. Next on the list, we have Venguswamy Ramaswamy, or Swami, luckily he likes to be called. Otherwise, I could be here for a long time. Globally heads the Tata Consultancy Services ION, which focuses on solutions for education industry and small and medium business manufacturers. Swami was instrumental in setting up the unit and driving the relevant domain solutions to this market. Earlier, as director of TCS's global consulting practice, he was pivotal in building the consulting organization, and the consulting magazine included him among the top 25 consultants of the year in 2007. Finally, and last but not least, we have Geoff Stead. Geoff is the Chief Product Officer at Babbel, leading the digital learning experience for millions of digital language learners. He's a global expert in the use of mobile and emerging technologies for teaching, learning, and behaviour change. Prior to Babbel, Geoff ran digital innovation teams at Cambridge, UK, and California. He has helped traditional publishers to move into digital learning, as well as helping digital learning business understand how emerging technology can better support education. But it doesn't say in his introduction, he also speaks regularly at international conferences, both on the technology side and on the education side. So welcome, Geoff. So those are the basic introductions. And what we're not going to do is stick to a traditional panel discussion where everybody gets 5 or 10 minutes to give a point of view. I prefer to go straight into some questions. We have some questions to start off with, but obviously we're hoping that these will be supplemented by questions from the audience. But I'd like to start on a positive note, because sometimes on these discussion panels, we tend to start looking at the difficulties involved in things like AI. So I'd like to start with Sir Nigel with a quick question. What, in your opinion, are the greatest successes in society and education of AI? Very briefly.
Well, thank you very much, Barry, and it's a pleasure to be with you all today. Well, the greatest successes, I mean, in some sense, we're immediately being confronted by them now, although it's not apparent, the ability to compress, route, and direct huge amounts of video and information traffic around the internet. A huge amount of that is actually managed by AI algorithms, which will be looking to optimize bandwidth, quality, connectivity. And so right down to the fundamental plumbing of the internet and web, AI is being deployed. People will often say, well, what distinguishes AI from any advanced algorithm? And we can have a substantial argument about that. But I would just say that insofar as modern AI's characterization is hugely around adaptivity and the ability to learn, we can see these functions at work in the algorithms that, as I say, direct and shape our traffic. But above and beyond that, we're carrying tons of AI around in the supercomputers in our pockets. The phones, the smartphones we carry around will variously recognize our faces, recognize our voices, direct us intelligently on a route, bring information to us from the World Wide Web. Huge numbers of applications in our daily life are being driven by AI methods. And in the context of education, it's really important, I think, to start to imagine that we're moving into a world in which AI as a service is the kind of dominant model, that it's more like a utility than a specific set of applications. And there are specific applications, of course, but so many of the systems we're interacting with now will have a learning component, will have an adaptive component, will have a component where there is some reasoning going on about the content that should be selected, could be selected, or about the content that is being presented to the system. So I think that we could extend that very substantially. And of course, one of the things I'm sure we'll be discussing today is how will that impact on the lived experience of our educational systems, and how does it impact on assessment? But we've witnessed ourselves, I think, recently, just how dramatically some of the AI services have improved, whether it's online translation, whether it is the ability to generate text or assess textual content, or whether it's the ability to organize and classify huge amounts of content online, whether that's imagery or video. Much of this organization of the world's knowledge, and that is a strapline from a company that used to kind of claim that it wanted to organize the world's knowledge. A lot of that organizational principle is being driven by ideas in AI, and we can explore some of those in more detail if that's appropriate. But I think it's also important to recognize that AI has been around for 50 years, and it's been steadily consolidating its successors. People notice it perhaps now, it's talked about more now, but in a fundamental sense, it's a broad suite of techniques that allow us to build more adaptive, agile, and knowledge-intensive applications.
Thank you. I'll pass it on to Swamy now to see if he has anything to add.
Just picking up from what Nigel said, one of the most important things, even though AI has been there for the last 50 plus years, but the hardware capabilities in today's context has made AI really possible, because as we rightly said, more than 20 billion smartphone devices today in the world, which is 3 times the population of this world itself, has really made AI come alive in my view, right? Today, without we knowing, in every credit card transaction, in every activity of voice getting converted to, say, for example, there is AI being embedded. The use cases has exploded as we see it today, primarily because the environment, the ability to process data at speed, the ability to process high volumes of data, the ability to process voice, all of those cases have made AI really possible and adopted, and particularly in the education space, you see adaptive testing really becoming a possibility, personalized learning path becoming a possibility today, remote assessments, proctor assessments, using secure assessments, all of them are becoming a possibility today. So AI, even though AI existed for several years, I think the ability to adopt it has becoming mainstream, and it will become more and more mainstream as the cost of doing this down dramatically, as I see it.
Thank you. And Geoff?
I liked Nigel's sort of reality check that it's actually already there in the plumbing all around us, and and Swamy's kind of calling out that it's the devices there too. So I like that as a sort of a build up to the fact that it's not an either or should we, it's already there. The bits that leapt up at me when I'm thinking what are the greatest successes were things where it's making noticeable difference to users' lives. So translation is a great one for that. That how rapidly the field of automatic translation, text to text, audio to text, different languages has accelerated in the last years, and how increasingly we can depend on it quite robustly to get reasonable understanding of different languages. I think that's really empowering. Also, another area I think which is a real success is some of the medicinal discovery drug testing work, where we're able to look at vast amounts of old data from the past and find new applications for old drugs, or find opportunities for compounds that we wouldn't have seen otherwise, would have taken infinitely longer to manually test and experiment. I think these are things that really change lives. And I guess sort of stitching together some of the translation ones, I love the change you're seeing in some of the accessibility tools that allow somebody who's blind to navigate around pretty standardly, like seeing AI. I can walk around with my phone out in front of me and it will tell me what it's seeing. It will tell me, it'll read signs, it'll read things I hold in front of it, it can guide me. TapTapC is another app that does that. Just voice recognition, so I can talk to computers, interact with my voice instead of typing. The auto transcription, you can probably even right now with the stream switch a switch and see transcription appearing underneath. And the fact that all of this is pretty good and just bundled in our regular tools is an amazing leap forward for greater accessibility and connecting to people who've got visual or various different disabilities that make it harder for them to interact in traditional ways with tech. So I guess these are things that I'm enthusiastic about.
Thank you. And I had a whole series of questions that I had planned to go through, but I see Kyle Smith has just come in with one already that I think is quite an interesting one. Kyle says, it might be already there, but that doesn't mean we should stop asking. Should we? So I think
that's a great question. I mean, I think, in fact, it's in the spirit of a couple of other questions I noticed as well around, data monopolies, and there's kind of a genuine worry around the ethics of deployment and what the downside might be. I mean, you invited us to think about how it's positively impacting environments around us, and I think it's really important that we do reflect on the empowering possibility of AI as a capability, but we have to be absolutely alert to the unintended consequences, the ways in which it might be used in ways that are not the best we might hope for in a range of contexts, including education. I mean, an earlier question says, are we going to be really replacing teachers in this context? And we know that there is an ineffable importance around human empathy and the ability of human teachers to engage and understand, simply because we share the same form of life as the kind of students in front of us. So that's hugely important. It's not going to be factored out by any machine anytime soon. The question is more broadly around should we use it? I mean, that's going to require us to ask questions about where is the data that's being used to make various forms of educational possibility available or assessment available? Is that being managed in an equitable fashion? Are there reasonable levels of consent for this happening in various ways? Do we know whether or not this can happen in a way that is equitable, in the sense that data that is used is fairly representative of say subpopulations who are being trained or assessed using this? There's a whole bunch of issues that surround the principles of deployment, the modes of deployment, and I think that you're seeing some people describe this as a renaissance of ethics, that actually people are thinking very hard about principles and governance, and that is exactly as it should be, and I'm sure we will want to kind of stress on that. So just because we can, should we? A fair question. But I think what we should recognize is what we can do, and to Swami's point as well, and Geoff's in a sense, the ubiquity and the power that is now deployed and the size of the data assets are bringing new capabilities into play, perhaps faster than we might have imagined, and the attendant important decisions of policy are more immediate than we might have imagined.
And would any of the other panel members like to comment?
Barry, if I can quickly,
please do.
If I can quickly add to what Nigel said, I also believe in every stage where there is a vast advancements. You look at when we went into internet, think about the world when we didn't have internet. When we all do a leap of gain, there is always going to be this kind of questions, and they are fast. I think it is the responsibility of governments, it is the responsibility of us to think about how do we protect privacy, how do we protect that are being asked. But thinking or getting worried about it, I don't think it's a right approach and solutions to address all of those things in parallel to progress and advancement in these areas as I see it.
I'm sure we're going to talk a lot more about the sort of the educational impact and how that plays out. I think the risk is to sleepwalk into these new emerging tool sets and capabilities, right? Because if you sleepwalk into it and just adopt what comes along, you don't necessarily get what we as humans need out the other side. You get what's easier to deliver or more commercially valuable to appear on your plate, or what fits in your phone or fits to a legacy education system. So I think it's super important to keep asking these questions and reality check what you're bringing in where. I think if you think about education as a holistic global challenge, you know, we're all joining together in the battle to try and educate the world, right? To try and get rid of some of the negativity that comes by lack of education. And that's an impossible problem to solve. There's just too many people and not enough ability and systems to cope with how we're growing and us being global. And so it's sort of unavoidable that we need to bring in new tools and new approaches to help us support more teachers in more places and more learners and to help this whole sort of ecosystem thrive. So it's unavoidable that we need new tools. And as part of that, it's unavoidable that we should probably recalibrate how we teach and how we assess to make the most of what the tools are good at and cut them out of the things that they're bad at. But that takes us adapting too. We can't just sit there and assume that it's going to fall into place like it used to be and we can control in the neat box the bit we're buying in. We do have to evolve and adapt to how these tools can be used in the same way that we do for any new tools that enter our lives. So I think, yeah, I'm optimistic about having these new tools, but recognizing that we as humans need to figure out how to fit them into a future version of our world and not the past version of our world.
Well, I do think we've already seen in the area of language education and assessment that regression, if you like, to the lowest of the low. What can the machine do? And if we test only what the machine does, we end up limiting what we test. We end up limiting what we teach as well. Do you think people are over trustworthy of AI? Do you think generally people ask enough questions?
There's a fascinating series of studies, not just with respect to AI, but any computer-aided instruction system, CAL, traditional CAL. Then there was a bunch of experiments run where they introduced deliberate bugs into the instructional material just to assess. This was actually in areas like mathematics, and they were trying to assess essentially how people responded, how they adjusted their mental models, where there was, in some sense, inconsistency in the originating material. And here's the interesting thing. Students would really struggle to accommodate and adjust to erroneous material from a machine, but kind of when he contrasted it with human teachers, kind of is human. So kind of people were much more kind of accepting of the fact that, okay, maybe this is a teacher error. Machines making errors really through the ability. So we have this kind of expectation that our machines are, in some sense, giving us great information. We know actually that's problematic. So we have a problem, I think, generally about ascribing, perhaps sometimes uncritically, the fact that the machine must have a superior view of the content being conveyed, which is slightly problematic. And to your point, I think there is a slight issue that we have to develop critical faculties. And this is, again, to an earlier question in the chat, I just noticed is around the challenge about misinformation. In a world in which misinformation is being pushed into so much of the online experience, and of course, there the danger is that the AI behind the recommender systems, behind the social platforms, start to amplify that for various reasons, because there the AI is looking to optimize click-throughs or follows rather than the kind of intrinsic veracity of the content. Now, how are we to deal with that? And so there's a whole set of processes we need to think about putting in place that think how do we deal with the kind of misinformation question, and how do we deal with the fact that we need to educate people in a degree of digital literacy that also invites them to be critical of the information. It may not be that the machine's got deliberately inserted errors. It may be that in some sense it's just reflecting a particular bias in the content that was from the training it was given or from the content it was given, which is to your point. So I think there are quite important questions about understanding the mental models that we form of these systems and how we can allow ourselves to bring our critical faculties to bear on those systems, just as we do with one another.
I agree enthusiastically, and I'm also puzzled or curious about human behaviors and how we as humans react, often in unpredictable ways, because it's very typical in a discussion about bringing AI into human decision-making situations to get a fairly solid level of skepticism. Oh, it's a bad idea, and there's lots of examples of bias, and there really are lots of examples of bias and it going wrong. But actually, when it comes down to it, if the computer if the computer guides you in a decision, a scarily large number of people accept that as a kind of authority figure. And that's a sort of behavioral thing. Even if you know that this decision is only giving you data based on looking at previous mortgage applications to guide you whether this is a good mortgage application, and there's probably all sorts of errors in it. The fact that it's saying yes or no to the mortgage application, people sort of fall into this mode of believing it has an authority. So there's a human behavior aspect which sort of has its own path, independently of actually our skepticism when we take a step back. And so I always find that quite interesting as well, how you play what people actually do and what we as a society discuss about.
Well, I do feel that we tend to blindly follow. I remember being in Italy once and ending up 100 meters from the hotel I was aiming for, but unfortunately about 120 steps, like as in up the stairs steps. The problem was I was in a car. I had blindly followed the machine, even when I realized this machine is taking me the wrong way. So we do have, I think, that propensity to assume that the machine is correct. But it is interesting, and I do agree with Nigel, particularly there, that we need to learn how to be critical of these machines in the same way as we're quite happy to be critical of humans. We need to be critical of machines as well.
But it's also important for us to keep in mind that human cognitive bias has always been there. We have been accepting those bias. And we also need to keep in mind that when it comes to AI, it is not going to be an overnight turn, because these machines have to learn, to go back to Geoff's example of mortgage applications. More and more the system is able to understand the past mortgage applications. The bias from the machine is going to be less. And when we are going through this transition, it's always important for the human intervention to decide what is right and what is wrong, and cannot be left to the machines completely. So that transition is going to be very important for us to go through.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought up the whole area of bias, because I think we can start looking into that area now. Because one question that comes into my mind immediately is, if the AI models integrate the bias from the data that is fed into them, is it ever possible to create an unbiased system, AI system?
Well, yeah, I think you're then going to really have to unpack the notion of what we mean by an unbiased or a fair response, and those terms trip off our tongue, but they're actually quite complex. And as you begin to unpack the notion of fair from what perspective, and these are very live debates right now. I mean, not least because in areas as consequential as education, like in justice, systems are being used to set bail, to advise on sentencing, in the justice system, and there is a lot of concern around the fact that will the training sets actually just consolidate existing biases? How do we flag that up? People have pointed out that human judgment is deeply, in some cases, problematic, but then they argue that it's not just a matter of the quality of the decision, it's about accountability, it's about redress, it's about the notion that we want in some cases to be judged by literally our peers or our equivalents, and not just algorithmically sorted and determined. So this will be a really huge area of contention and discussion. I think Swamy points out some of the hopes about where we might get to, but I think that as we look into where the sources of systematic unrepresentativeness might originate, sometimes it is in the nature of the originating training set. There's this challenge in machine learning called distributional shift. How can I guarantee that when trained on one set, I can move it to operate equivalently on unseen data? And from everything to the selection of bridal dresses to skin lesions, we've seen and face recognition, we've seen examples of systems where that's been problematic. And then within language assessment, we have this really interesting challenge that, of course, we know that the fundamental metrics around availability of training data are what they are for the world's languages. They're massively overrepresented in some contexts and for some types of content, and very underrepresented elsewhere. And that brings us back then to the issue of equity, which is that, yes, there are 4 phones for every person on the planet, but the internet has gotten to precisely half the world's population, and in some of the rest of the population, the access to these super smart devices is not equivalent by gender or socio-demographic or whatever. So they're just, you keep coming back to these issues around the values we want to promote and care for. And equity and fairness, as we begin to unpack them, will be absolutely core, no question.
Swamy, would you like to add to that? Or Geoff?
I was just going to add a very tiny subnote to Nigel's piece. I really like the work that's happening where they're looking at training data sets and querying them with different lenses and segmenting to see what's the gender bias in this data set, what's the racial bias, what's the geographic bias, and trying to actively address some of those biases. There was, lots of examples of things being skewed or going wrong. The Amazon recruiting one, or the various ways of skewing based on the training data. And I quite like the idea that you actually need to really spring clean quite proactively your training data via as many different segments as possible. I know it's an almost impossible task, but at least it's recognizing that the importance of that.
And when you see systems built around large information bases like BART and that, do you think that is something that we can live with? Where people like Google create these huge, what is the latest one, 28 billion data points or something. Is that the future, to put as much information in as possible and try to build a system, or should we be managing that information? So is bigger better, or should it be more focused?
I think in the domain that we are talking about, the core to leverage some of the best outcomes from our AI is going to be dependent on the training set, the pertinent data. So the bigger set of pertinent data, the better AI systems are going to be. One of the things that we are actually working on from a country like India, we are never short of data. Just the sheer volume of access to data that we have, and the set of governance and mechanisms that we put in place to continuously train these systems will determine whether these AI systems can deliver to the needs of the society itself, Barry. So it's all going to be dependent on highly voluminous, pertinent training set that we can use in order to build the systems, and that's the key here.
I'd like to see what the other panelists think about the move to be more open and transparent about the training data and about the models that are used. I know in the sort of open source community, the software community, that's really helped to have some of the best security software has been built in an open, transparent way because there's more eyes on it. And I know in the machine learning space, there's sort of some people are trying to be very open about their models. Is that a good thing, being very transparent about the data, or is that have other risks?
Geoff, I think this is a very, very important point that you brought in. Any performance of any system, why it is behaving this way, and the transparency to trace back the output a system is giving is going to be very, very fundamental. And I believe over a period of time, the society is going to ask, can you also tell me why the system gave this recommendation? What went behind it in order to this recommendation? And this question will be there, and this question needs to be answered as we see it.
Yeah, and I think Barry was also hinting, and I think we're aware of the emergence. I talked about AI as a service, and a lot of particularly the language services that are being, and image labeling, recognition services that are being offered now are adaptations to or modifications to these very, very large underlying models that have been built by the likes of Google or OpenAI, Microsoft. These are now known as foundation models because they seem to be fundamentally at such scale and have so many effective parameters that they're unreasonably effective. So this is where people kind of play around with things like GPT-3, which generates apparently sensible generated text, or can autocomplete sentences or paragraphs or short summaries really very powerfully indeed. And I think then the notion is, well, how many of these models are there? I mean, as you were hinting, Barry, I mean, some of these are huge. I mean, the GPT-3 was trained, a latest version was trained on something like 45 terabytes of data, billions of parameters, ran thousands of effectively, or hundreds of years of effective cloud compute time, and cost a lot of money to train. Who's got the resources to build these and then curate and steward them? And I think there's going to be quite a debate around the nature of these fundamental models, how transparent they are, how well understood they are. Do we know what their intrinsic qualities around bias and behavior might be? And I think that's going to be a very, very live debate. And I think on the other hand, there is a real movement which has always promoted open development. So the open source and open data movements, I'm very supportive of these movements. I mean, there will always be limits on where you want to take that around personal and sensitive data, but I think transparency can be our friend here, respecting that, of course, there will be trade secrets of various sorts, but I think that there will need to be, for all sorts of governance reasons, an ability to get behind and underneath some of this code and the data assets themselves to understand them. And these monopolies, these data monopolies, these model monopolies are emerging almost, they're just happening. And I think the companies themselves are kind of wondering how they will bring some of this stuff into proper regulation and governance.
Yes, and we've seen some examples over the last number of years of people working for these large monopolies who, when they talk openly and truthfully about their systems, find themselves unemployed or employed elsewhere. So it is a massively large question that I think we haven't really come to grips with yet, but it is something that we should be thinking about. I'm just looking at some questions here. What do you believe is the most compelling case for AI in assessment? Is it that countries in the global south need the global north algorithms in order to educate their people? And that's from Kyle again.
I think if I look at it, the ability to do high volumes of assessment, and I'm saying this from a context of India, at least, just to give you some scale perspective for here. We have on any large recruitment assessments or learning assessments, the number of people who actually participate in those kind of assessments is pretty large and high volume stuff. So the most compelling case, as I see, is to get an ability to process such high volumes of data in assessment. That's a very compelling case, as I see it.
I guess we have to ask ourselves, sorry, Geoff.
No, I was just wanting to build on that. I quite liked your response there, Swami, that actually the opportunity is around the administration rather than a magic of the assessment itself, just on the logistics side. And I thought that was a nice response, because when I read the question, I immediately jumped to the actual, speech processing, speech and scoring your abilities at language and writing, and I thought that was a nice thing. I'm no longer. I used to work at Cambridge English, so I'm from the assessment, have some assessment background, but it's no longer an area that I work in deeply. So from the EdTech language learning app, slightly looser framing, when I hear questions like that, I do wonder whether we're even trying to solve the right challenge with the assessment challenge. There's the assessment industry is a bit, if you call it an industry, is a bit trapped in a quite a Victorian kind of model of large cohorts in a physical room, tests. They all take the same test, leave scores, sort of like testing as a cohort. And I think the real opportunity, the today opportunities are exactly where Swami took us. It's sort of logistics, it's scale, it's administration, it's helping process this quite cumbersome system. But if you really look tomorrow at how to exploit what's coming out of the AI tools, natural language processing, it could change how we think about assessment to take you to the next generation of what language learning progress looks like. And it could be as much about meaningful feedback to the learners, about some sort of ongoing micro assessments, so that it's not all around security at that 1 3-hour moment, but it's about ongoing understanding how they're progressing in language usage. So I get quite excited when I think when I sort of unpack what's happening where assessment is going on right now, and understanding what does the system really need? What do the students need? What do the future people who would see a certification need? What does the education system need? And I think if you weave it back together again, there's some quite exciting opportunities there that would leverage the tech more. So when I'm thinking about it, I don't particularly think about the North and the South at all. I'm more thinking about the capabilities of the tools and the problems being faced by that geography or that education system.
That's a nice thought. Yeah, I think that's a great couple of great some great points there made by my fellow panelists. And I mean, this is not my area of specialization, but one thing I would anticipate is that I've always thought of AI as a technology to augment us, ideally, rather than oppress us. It's another set of tools to extend our cognitive and our mental abilities. And of course, as we do that, we change the balance of what we regard as being something we inherently value or need to support in our human cognition. And so, without being too controversial, I ask myself, in a world in which the Babbel fish will just be effectively, Douglas Adams' imagined real-time translation system, will be a technology that is certainly viable in some sense, practically effective in some sense already with the translation systems we have, for all of its kind of lack of nuance. The question is this a world which will support more language variety and diversity, because people don't have to get out of their home languages in some sense? Will we be looking to assess different things rather than just an expressive capability? And it invites you to ask the question, what is the fundamental set of skills that we're looking to prize and assess here? And without opening that up too much, I think it is incumbent on us to think about, what bits of the tasks we value and prize do we want our AIs to support us with, and our tools to help us with, and does that result in a certain sort of general de-skilling? So again, I think it's really interesting that the technology invites the domain of assessment to reflect in quite a lot of detail, I'd imagine, on what is valuable and what is prized, and what the purpose is of these skills that we value and assess at the moment.
Barry, if I can take 30 seconds, I just want to add to Geoff's point. Just imagine we conduct a 20 million candidate assessment in the country, not just the administration part of it. Of course, how do you manage identity of these people and ensure that it is being done in a secured way? I think AI plays a very significant role. But leave that aside, if it is going to be a subjective assessment, how do you manage such high volume responses and mark them in at least a unbiased way? It's a massive challenge which we cannot even imagine solving it without very, very powerful algorithms behind it.
Yeah, I agree that it is a huge challenge in assessment when it comes to the assessment of the productive skills in language. But just to go back to Geoff's point, we've already started working in this area of assessment as opposed to testing, where we're looking at building assessment systems into learning systems with the view, and it's been my view for at least the last 6 or 7 years, that the future of testing is that there should be either an option for no test at all, or an option that you can take a test, but there should be other ways of assessing people, because if we're living in a digital world. But I want to go back a little bit, because it's a point that was made a little bit earlier. And that's the whole area of, you said 20 billion phones, but Sir Nigel reminded us that only about half the people in the world actually have access to the internet. So isn't there an issue here that we also have to deal with that accessibility, so that we can have all of the wonderful systems we like, but if they're only available to half the people, well, then we're actually growing the gap between people.
But Barry, don't you think it is a chicken or egg question? Because in many such advancements, see, think through this. A smartphone's computing power today is 120 million times faster than what were used in the first mission to the moon. So we have to keep in mind that these models will change, technology will run a bit, the capabilities will lag, capabilities will take a jump, technology need to catch up. I think this is going to be a activity that will grow together. Yes, we do, particularly in a country like India. Many places are completely delinked, but because of advancements in technology, now the government policies, both from the center as well as state and the private institutions, they're all working to figure out how do we pull them and bring in that equity that Nigel talked about earlier.
Yeah, I mean, I think there is this whole argument about, the perfect can't be the enemy of the good, and one is, you're seeing the growth rates are still there, and people are definitely worrying about connectivity more generally. And within societies where there is variable access to these resources, very markedly, sometimes, say, gender related, sometimes related to socioeconomic class. But I mean, there is, I think we should always have that at the back of our minds. And to Swami's point, the inevitable consequence of the exponents of our technology means that power, memory, capacity is just doubling pretty well every 15 months, and the cost of that is pretty well halving. So I mean, that just keeps going and going. It's just an extraordinary set of developments, and so we can imagine that, as I said, this will become a service at scale, much as power and light is a service at scale. And the question is how you tap into it, what devices you use to tap into that capability. There's a more interesting question around whether or not there are other models. That we've got a very centralized model of way our AI and our data is being collected and managed at the moment. We've given it up to the cloud. There are other architectures, various forms of edge or decentralized computing that might come to play an interesting role, and they might actually have legitimate and interesting purposes within all sorts of contexts, including education.
I think the global access and equity is a super interesting topic, and there's multiple dimensions to it. So whether we like it or not, governments, institutions are privileging people who have digital access to them than people who don't have digital access to them. And you see that in the sort of wealthy West, you see that in the more impoverished South, that people who have access to internet, data, connectivity are getting better rates on loans, they're getting better pricing for their produce that they're selling. So that it's this sort of wave which is very, very difficult to see any way of being equitable about unless you can really help spread access and spread tech literacy even faster. Also, reflecting back on the human behavior side, I have lots of interesting conversations with educators who want to roll out a learning platform to vast number of digitally poorly served communities and are very big on the learning platform part or the system part. But in actual fact, when you go into those communities, the thing that really drives behaviors is much simpler. It's WhatsApp, it's cheaper ways to connect to family, it's cheaper ways to share local news or to buy and sell local produce. The human behavior side is more rooted in communication and a more kind of bottom-up grassroots needs. And it's often not the well-wishing educator systemic here roll out this big solution. And so I think when we think about helping tech or helping access to grow globally, it really does help to allow the sort of sporadic different tech in different regions in different ways best suited to local needs. So I quite like the slightly at the edge of where the internet is rolling out and the devices people are using to connect to it. It is quite fragmented. It is quite locally skewed by different geographies and different languages and different devices. And I think that's actually a natural part that should be embraced rather than trying to control centrally, which I know sometimes you fall into in education discussions.
And does anybody have a view as to whose responsibility do you think it might be to ensure that we grow the percentage of people with useful access to the system?
I think this has to be answered in various different contexts. Today, these conversations are getting into policy level at governments, which is a good thing as we see it, right? For example, the NEP, the National Education Policy, is bringing all of those aspects in terms of equity, in terms of responsibility, in terms of access as part of the policy itself. And when it gets into the policy, then it becomes much more easier. Board conducting an assessment is accountable to make sure that each one of the candidates have equal access. If not, they have to find alternate ways to provide that access. So the accountability and responsibility automatically gets rested with the board in this example. And I think that's the right direction to move on. And I'm just picking up from what Geoff said, that it is not going to be one central body that is going to be responsible. It has to be driven into the policies, and then the responsibilities has to be moved to the right set of stakeholders in a specific use case.
I've got a question back to Barry. So in the assessment world, so assume I don't know, the British Council rolling out assessments, adopting AI as part of the speaking test to help evaluate levels. Who's accountable there? Who's accountable for a bad judgment call being made or a bad erroneous results?
You've just read my mind. I was about to ask you the same question, exactly the same question, because when you think about it, the tests that we produce, we don't build the technology, we work with technology partners. We then use their technology, and then our tests are used by receiving organizations. So if the receiving organization is a university and it rejects you based on a score that a student has received on my test, is it the receiving organization is responsible? Is it the British Council is responsible? Or is it the tech company responsible? Or to what extent do they share responsibility? And I think that's a really big question that we struggle with, because in some ways we're all responsible. And what we've tried to do, as far as our responsibility is concerned, is we've started to look at how we can validate the AI models that we use. What are the kind of things that we can actively do to generate information that we can understand and that our receiving organizations can understand, that reassure us that we have done what we can to ensure that the systems are working appropriately.
But Barry, I would suggest, see, as you rightly said, all the three are responsible. There is no question about it. The technology company is responsible. In this case, British Council is responsible, as well as the university is responsible. But the key here is to be transparent between the university and the student. That is the key here. Because if the university says, look, this is how we have scored you, this is the approach that we have taken to score you, and it is very transparently shared, number one. Number two, it gives an opportunity for the student to ask a question, to object to something, to raise a query. Then you are giving that space to the student to ask a question on a mission that could have potentially made a mistake as well in scoring, right? But you have an opportunity to validate, you have an opportunity to verify. If these two things happen, in our opinion, we are in the right direction because we are giving an opportunity. It happens here in India. We have an opportunity given to the student called objection management process, where the student can object to a made decision, and he will be given the reasoning behind it in order to get convinced, or there will be a correction that will be made. And it's a process that has to deal with that, in our opinion, Barry.
But I think that's going to become an increasingly fraught area, because I think redress, and it's great you've got these processes in place, but of course what we know with a lot of the modern AI methods is that people worry they are black boxes. So, you know, there's a huge number of cases it's been trained on. It's come up with a very accurate determination in some sense, and you ask why. Now, what is the nature of the explanation you give back to the student? You know, you've some formulaic set of rules that you can appeal to, probably unlikely in a high dimensional neural network model. Is it an appeal to that your case looks a lot like another individual's case where a similar decision was reached? Is it around a demographic, you know, some placement of you across the whole population of people in an assessment? Is it something to do with the particular characteristics of your actual assessment answer? And there are lots of ways an explanation can be an explanation, and we know this is an active area of research. It must be very consequential, I suspect, in an area like assessment. You know, what counts? Yeah.
I guess the one thing I've seen the British Council working on is they try to speak to their suppliers to come up with a clear explanation of what training data was used. What is the demographic, or what is the data that was used in the system? And I guess in theory, to follow Barry's example of supplier made this, we build the test, we distribute it to that person, some of this data could travel along down the feeding chain. And so you would be able to see, as a young Indian male from southern India who's taken the test, that actually all the data was trained on, or predominantly on, women from North India, and that maybe there's something in the speech, maybe there's something around voice accuracy, or so actually some of that data would travel with the test, and that perhaps that could be the way of managing your appeal. I mean, I'm just sort of freestyling here, but I quite like the fact that there is an appeal in Swamy's setup, because it's clarifying that the system isn't perfect, and there is a sort of a route back again, that you're not just a victim to it. So I'm just trying to kind of work with that and see what could help.
Well, one of the things that we've discovered along the way, and I see there's a question that I tried to get back to from William Bayliss, who was actually one of our team working on this project that you mentioned, Geoff, was it took us quite a long time to learn the language to actually communicate effectively with the technology team. We realized early on that we just didn't have the language. We didn't have the knowledge of the area, and we didn't have the language. We had to learn both. And it seems to me that one of the issues is that if we look to test takers and receiving organizations, we have to empower them by allowing them to discover, or helping them to discover, I should say, the kind of questions they need to ask, the kind of language they need to use. So it is a communication issue. And it was one of the greatest drawbacks to our project, was that we just we couldn't talk to each other at the beginning. But
I think
actually,
that William's question is a brilliant question, and that's absolutely, I agree 100%, and that's important for us to involve the end users in many instances to make sure that that confidence is built. But it is not going to be feasible in all the use cases, Larry. There will be scenarios where it may not be feasible for us to do it, but where it is possible, we should take that approach.
actually, I just point you, sorry, Geoff.
No, you go. I was going to respond to some of the questions coming through on from the audience.
Well, I'm just looking at the one from William Bayliss at the moment. The machine can arguably be seen as an appendage of those who create it. Should there be a move to ensure that the end users are represented not only in training data, but also in the teams who design and build machines?
Easier said than done, but yes, where it is possible in certain use cases, I believe it's a good idea to do that, but it may not be feasible in all scenarios as we see it.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think reality will bite at some stage, that it's not going to be feasible all the time. But it is an interesting question nonetheless. Now, I'm just keeping an eye on our time here, because we've been speaking for just over an hour, and it's just disappeared as far as I'm concerned. Now, I have another question here, not from the chat, but a different question. When education is essentially an activity in the human sphere, and language testing in particular is dependent on social context, is there a danger that with AI we are reducing learners and their learning assessment paths to a set of data points, which in turn will dictate what we assess and what we judge to have value? Will we inadvertently usher in the rise of the psychometricians, the sequel?
I give you back the multiple choice test. Isn't that exactly the same? But from that it's a very, very crude metric that picks certain data points and can lead people teaching to tests and things like that, which is it has its place, but it's not everything. I mean, yes, it's true. It is true. It's a very human thing. And if you're really trying to assess somebody's ability, you need to find a way of mixing the things that technology can do and the things that humans can do, and recalibrating what that mix is. And to Swami's point, you don't want the humans to be doing tons of admin type tasks that a computer can do. They do that very fast and cheaply. But equally, you don't want to delegate to a computer things that are really human aspects of understanding. And that's really why it needs a breadth of different skills and disciplines to meaningfully engage in these conversations and not just sit quietly and assume they'll happen.
I mean, that's a great point. I mean, ironically, actually, Tim Berners-Lee back in the day introduced this notion of what he called social machines, which was the idea that machines would precisely do the routine stuff and people would be liberated to do the more interesting aspect of this, of their kind of daily lives. Of course, you can look at literally what's happened with things like Mechanical Turk, and what you're doing is you're having the machines, allocate really tedious work for human beings to do. So always thinking about that balance of what is valuable and how we're thinking of the the end user, the human in this, as an end in themselves and not the means. And I think that's again one of these things that brings us back to consideration of values in all of this. But to the point that these systems do allow us to execute on huge amounts of decisions that otherwise, just become impossible to deal with. There's something really interesting about that idea about how we do balance and how we give redress back so that we feel that, the entire HR function of increasing numbers of companies is fronted by a bunch of AI algorithms, which it's very hard to know how you get beyond first base. And it strikes me that we do need to kind of keep interrogating the notion of what are the things we look to promote, what are the machines intrinsically being set up and engineered to note and characterize. And the point made about, doesn't the data already embody some views about what is important? Absolutely right. Every data set in some sense comes with an implicit, often implicit and not always made explicit set of decisions about why this data is incorporated as being fundamentally important. So if it does anything at all, it should invite the system developers to really have this richer, and we talked about it in the panel earlier on, to have this richer dialogue around different perspectives, different embeddings, different wider contexts about why this data is justified. And that, even for the most pedestrian of cases, that matters.
And it brings up the area of de-skilling that we mentioned earlier, doesn't it? There is that danger. Right. Well, what we're going to do now is, I think we've got under 10 minutes left. So what I'd like to do is I've got a single question that I'd like to ask each of you panel members to think about just for a few minutes. And the question is, what role do you see AI playing in education, language, and generally in the coming years? And how optimistic are you? And I'd like to start with Geoff this time.
I guess I'll start with the, I guess it was David Thornburg's quote, who said something like, any teacher that can be replaced by a computer deserves to be. I don't mean that quite as provocatively as it might sound. I think the role of AI in education is going to be to help us teach more people more effectively with the human infrastructure that we have today. So try and help more teachers have more impact, to reach more students in a more meaningful way. And so trying to find the blend of the human and the tech that fits together, and really trying to find the sweet spot between those. I'm cautiously optimistic. I'm an optimism because I think we have some huge challenges ahead of us globally in trying to fight ignorance, in trying to build an educated, empowered society. We can't do it how we're going at the moment. We can't keep up. We don't have the scale, the reach. We have to find new tools. AI and some of the tech and accessibility are the tools that are helping us get there. I'm cautious because we really need to adapt our own thinking as humans. We need to figure out what our role is, how we interact with technology, how we teach, how we assess, and we're being very slow at that as humans. Looking back for the last 50 years, we haven't actually changed that much. And so that brings me some caution, because I think we need to take this seriously and step in and sort of reflect on how we're doing it. And I think we need a lot more transparency on the data, diversity of thinking at the coalface, kind of maturity around how we think about ethics and bias and more disciplines engaging in this topic. So yeah, my caution is actually on the human side, that we're too slow to really take the right advantage of this, and we sort of sleep our way into it.
Very good, thank you. And Swamy.
I'm going to put my bet on maybe 3-4 things, Barry. So bear with me if it is bizarre. Okay. So I feel that there will be a scenario of language independent learning. So I may be a Dutch, I may be a Japanese. It really doesn't matter. I can learn from anyone because it's happening. It's getting improved, but that's one of the big bets for me. I'm going to put 3-4 that comes to the top of my mind. So language independent learning. It doesn't matter which language I know. It doesn't matter which language my teacher knows, but we will learn. Right? That's one big ticket. Second, I think we have seen significant advancements in this is learning getting very personalized based on human amount of data about me that the machine knows, and a large amount of data on the subject which I'm learning, which again the machine knows. So this should not be seen as personalization. It's a personalization plus, because the way I think, the way I behave, the speed in which I do things, I believe there is a huge opportunity, and that will be a reality. It's almost there. I think that's a big bet. The third one, which I feel, is ability to bring in huge volumes, formats of content together to make learning more effective. That's another big bet. As we all know, content is becoming obsolete very, very fast, right? Today, we don't talk about a flash content. So that's another third area in the space of education. I believe it will play a very, very big role. And the last one, if I can say, is teachers playing a higher order role, and teachers today being taken over by machines. Most part of what teachers do today being taken over by machines. We have an experiment in India, in one of the schools in Bangalore, where a machine walks into the classroom to teach, and the teacher is sitting somewhere in the corner of the room in order to oversee whether everything is going right or wrong. That's going to be another big bet we can see. And I'll stop here, Barry.
Thank you. Very interesting points. Really great stuff. So Nigel.
Gosh, those are great points. I'm not sure that they're really, really nicely articulated. I guess I'd just say, I sit here in the University of Oxford, and it's a strange old place. It's an old institution which has been very, I say disrupted in a positive sense by the pandemic. And of course, the whole place is predicated on social proximity. So you teach in the tutorial system face-to-face. What we've seen is that the ability to pivot a system like that and have large-scale digital content, suddenly be being made available. Students like that, the assessment models have changed, but the thing that they really value is the close-on exchange. It's a cheesy thing to say, but to remind ourselves that this, at the best, education is the preparation of the life of the mind. And then actually that's about bringing critical faculties to bear. So in a world of superabundant information and rich content, the most important thing to try and inculcate is those critical capabilities. We're all data scientists now in some sense. We're all in some sense needing to think about how to assess and calibrate. And it's those meta skills that I'd like to see really kind of coming through, because that is the province, that's the one area where we know humans as well have this very interesting ability to know the limits of what they know and to have a sense of uncertainty and error bars around what they know. And that's a really valuable thing, I think, to help promote. And I just defer to all the other great points made by my colleagues. I think it's going to be a very exciting time. I think the notion of lifelong learning and lifelong longitudinal data sets that support that is going to be quite transformative. We'll see a form of personalized education that sits alongside personalized medicine, and that's going to be exciting.
We seem to have a bit of a I'm not sure what's going on here. I've just been told we still have some minutes left, but my schedule told me we finish at 5 minutes to 1, and it's now exactly 5 minutes.
We're basically wrapped up there, I think, Barry. So you can say a few final words, and we're nearly done.
Right, well, that's good. I thought I had completely lost the plot yet again. I really enjoyed, I don't know about the panel members or the audience, but I really enjoyed myself this morning. I thought that was a fantastically useful and a really interesting session. I'm kind of sorry I didn't ask that last question a little bit earlier, because I think we could have gone on and talked about it. I have my own concerns. I think the future, one of the areas we have that Swamy mentioned with the machine teaching and the teacher on one side, I think that's all very interesting. What happens if the powers that be decide that maybe we don't need that teacher anymore, and the system is taken over by machines? I'm not convinced that that is the way forward, and I think it could lead to a dystopian world. I think it could be a real issue for many education systems around the world, but that's just me. Normally, I am a glass half full person. So I think our discussions today gave us a really good idea of the kind of things we need to be thinking about over the next, not just years, but months. I think we, as Geoff alluded to there, I've been involved in education. I started teaching in a secondary school 44 years ago, and it essentially has not changed since. And for me, that's pretty bloody shocking that everything else has changed, but that hasn't. I've been involved in assessment for nearly 30 years. That's hardly changed. Looking at some of the modern tests that I see out there, their delivery, it has changed. They look nice. They're often generated, one of them totally generated by a machine, but the test itself looks like it was built in 1955. So there are challenges. There are lots of challenges, but I think with people such as those represented on the panel today around, I think the future is actually quite bright. So again, thank you very much to the 3 panel members, and thank you to the audience for some fantastically stimulating questions. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Great. Enjoyed it very much.
Okay.
Yeah. Have a great day. Thanks a lot.
Yeah. Bye. Thanks a lot. Thanks, Geoff, Swamy, and Nigel.